There is something deeply unsettling about watching a teenager stand in a courtroom and hear the words, "life in prison." Because at that age, most kids are worried about prom or passing their driving test. But every single person on this list made a choice so violent, so calculated, that the justice system decided they would never get to live a normal life. Some of them broke down, some sat there like statues, and a few had the nerve to smirk. So, here are 9 teenagers who were handed life sentences, and how they reacted when the gavel came down. Aaron Campbell.
Aaron Thomas Campbell, you were found guilty of the abduction, rape and murder of Alicia McPhail, a 6-year-old child.
On the night of the 2nd of July 2018, a 16-year-old boy was restless on the Isle of Bute, a small island off the west coast of Scotland. He had been at a party with friends earlier that evening and was coming down from smoking cannabis. He was agitated, fidgety, and looking for more drugs. The Isle of Bute is a quiet, relatively small community where most people know each other, and Campbell was not exactly unknown around town. At some point, he grabbed a kitchen knife from his home and left. Campbell walked to the home of Robert McPhail, a man he had previously bought cannabis from. The two had fallen out over a drug debt a few months earlier, and McPhail had stopped responding to his messages. But Campbell did not go there to settle that score. The door to the home was unlocked. Campbell slipped inside without waking any of the adults sleeping there. Inside one of the rooms, he found 6-year-old Alicia McPhail, Robert's daughter, who was visiting from the mainland for her summer holiday. She had only been on the island for 3 days, staying at her grandparents' home in the island's main town of Rothesay. Campbell picked the child up and told her he was a friend of her father's and that he was taking her home. He carried her, roughly half a mile, through the quiet streets to the grounds of a demolished hotel nearby. Multiple CCTV cameras along the route captured him carrying her. What he did to her at that location was so extreme that a post-mortem examination later revealed 117 separate injuries on her body. He sexually assaulted her, then suffocated her by applying sustained pressure to her face and neck. After killing Alicia, Campbell walked to the shore and threw his blood-stained clothing into the sea. Then he realized he had left his phone at the scene, so he went back to retrieve it. He returned home and went about his day, denying any involvement to family members when the child was reported missing. She was reported missing at 6:23 a.m., and her body was discovered by a member of the public at around 8:54 a.m. Campbell was arrested 3 days later. At trial, he denied everything, and not just casually. He lodged a special defense of incrimination, which meant he formally accused someone else of the crime. He pointed the finger at Robert McPhail's 18-year-old girlfriend, claiming she had killed Alicia and framed him. He even took the stand and told the jury his DNA must have been planted at the scene. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. DNA evidence, clothing fibers, and CCTV footage his own mother had helped provide all tied him directly to the crime. After a 9-day trial in Glasgow, the jury took just 3 hours to convict him unanimously. Before sentencing, he finally admitted his guilt to a psychologist preparing a report for the court. In that confession, he described seeing Alicia asleep in her room as a moment of opportunity. He said once he saw her, killing her was all he could think about. He also said he didn't think he would have done it if he had been a year younger. The judge, Lord Matthews, sentenced Campbell to life with a minimum of 27 years, calling him a cold, callous, calculating, remorseless, and dangerous individual. He also noted Campbell's breathtaking lack of remorse, saying he had not detected a single flicker of emotion from him throughout the entire trial. Campbell also later admitted to a psychologist that he had almost burst out laughing during the proceedings. That minimum was later reduced to 24 years on appeal because of his age at the time of the crime. Alicia's family was furious with the decision, and so was almost everyone else. Paris Bennett.
After emergency services turned up at the house?
I remember that a male officer walking past me and into the bedroom, and I remember hearing him mutter, "Oh my God."
It's a crime that is unthinkable. It's called sororicide, the act of killing one's own sister. Their mom says they were inseparable. 13-year-old Paris Bennett was a loving and protective big brother to 4-year-old Ella.
On Super Bowl Sunday, the 4th of February 2007, a 13-year-old boy in Abilene, Texas, was home with his 4-year-old sister Ella and a babysitter, while their mother, Charity, was working a late shift at Buffalo Wild Wings. His name was Paris Lee Bennett, and by every outward appearance, he seemed like a bright, well-adjusted kid. He had an IQ of 141, which put him in the genius range. The family had moved to Abilene from Georgia a few years earlier, and by all accounts, Ella was a happy, outgoing little girl enrolled at Abilene Christian schools. But that night, around 10 p.m., Paris convinced the babysitter to leave the house. He told her their mother was coming home early and that everything was fine. Once the babysitter was gone, Paris was alone with his 4-year-old sister, and that was exactly what he wanted. Before that night, Paris had been sexually abusing Ella. His semen was later found on her remains, meaning the killing was also an attempt to make sure she could never tell anyone. Sometime before 11:30 p.m., he went to Ella's bedroom with a knife. He stabbed her 17 times as she lay in her bed, then also beat and choked her. The violence was extreme, sustained, and deliberate. After the stabbing, Paris called a school friend and talked to him on the phone for about 6 minutes. Then he dialed 911 at 11:42 p.m. On the call, he was crying and told the dispatcher he had accidentally killed someone. He claimed he had seen his sister as a demon and had stabbed her because of a hallucination. The dispatcher asked him to perform CPR on Ella. Paris pretended to do it, counting along while pacing around the room without ever actually touching her body. Investigators knew fairly quickly that his story did not add up. He eventually admitted that everything was premeditated. He told investigators he had carried a burning resentment toward his mother for years. Charity had struggled with drug addiction and had relapsed into cocaine use when Paris was 11. During that period, Paris had been forced to step in and take care of Ella himself. That resentment built up over years until it consumed him. He said he chose to kill Ella specifically because he knew it would devastate his mother in the worst possible way. He had actually planned to kill Charity too when she came home from work, but he changed his mind before she got home. He decided that dying would let her off too easy. He wanted her to suffer for the rest of her life. By killing Ella and going to prison, Charity would lose both of her children at once, which was exactly the point. Paris was diagnosed with conduct disorder during the legal proceedings and met criteria for psychopathy. He pleaded guilty to capital murder in juvenile court in August 2007 and received the maximum sentence allowed for a juvenile in Texas at the time, 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. His case drew national attention not just because of the crime itself, but because of how methodically and coldly Paris spoke about it in the years that followed. He is currently incarcerated at the Ferguson unit in Texas and could potentially be released as early as 2027. Tori Adamsick and Brian Draper.
Story, September 22nd, 2006. Skipping last 4th hour.
Good evening and thanks for watching tonight. I'm Todd Blackington. Today, the Idaho Supreme Court rejected the appeal of Tori Adamsick, upholding his convictions in the 2006 murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard. One of the men convicted of killing Cassie Jo Stoddard 5 years ago this month could soon be back on trial in Pocatello.
On the 22nd of September 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddard was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle at their home on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bennett County, Idaho, just outside the city of Pocatello. Her relatives were out of town for the weekend and she was looking after their pets. That evening, her boyfriend Matt Beckham came over around 6 p.m. and the two settled in to watch a movie. Later that night, 2 of their classmates from Pocatello High School showed up. Brian Draper and Tori Adamsick, both also 16, stopped by to hang out. Draper had moved to Pocatello from Utah, and the two had bonded over a shared interest in filmmaking, horror films, and notoriety. The 4 of them sat in the living room and started watching Kill Bill, Volume 2 together, but Draper and Adamsick left before the movie ended, saying they were going to catch another movie at the theater. They were not going to any theater. They had already identified Cassie as their target the day before and planned the whole thing in detail. On the tape, one of them could be heard saying they had found their victim, describing how perfect the setup was. An isolated house, no adults around, the weekend. Before leaving, one of them had quietly unlocked a basement door so they could get back in later. After Matt went home and Cassie was alone, they returned. They cut the power to the house to scare her. They put on masks and armed themselves with hunting knives and a dagger. Then they entered through the basement and made their way upstairs. They found Cassie and stabbed her at least 29 times. What made this case notorious was a videotape the two had made in the days leading up to the murder. On the tape, they talked about wanting to be more famous than killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. Draper described himself as a social outcast who struggled to fit in and had a particular obsession with the 1999 Columbine massacre. They discussed how this would be their first kill and that they intended to become serial killers. The plan was modeled after the movie Scream, right down to the masks and the isolated house. After the killing, they drove to an area near Black Rock Canyon and buried the evidence, including the knives, the masks, and their blood-stained clothing. They attempted to burn the videotape, but it survived well enough for investigators to recover and watch it. Cassie's body was discovered 2 days later, on September 24, when her aunt and uncle returned home. Police initially focused on Matt Beckham, but he passed a polygraph and mentioned that Draper and Adams had been at the house that night. When detectives interviewed the two, their stories fell apart fast. Draper eventually broke down during questioning and led investigators to the buried evidence. Both were tried as adults in separate trials in 2007. Both were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder by Judge Peter McDermott, and both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Draper tried to claim in his confession that it was all supposed to be a joke and that Adams had started the stabbing without warning. The courts did not buy it. Both have appealed their sentences multiple times over the years, and both remain behind bars. Andrew Conley.
Good evening. Tanya has the night off. The 18-year-old who pleaded guilty to killing his 10-year-old brother says he's sick. How could anyone kill his own brother, especially a 10-year-old boy? Today, prosecutors released video of Andrew Conley.
A surprise plea today in the case of an Indiana boy accused of strangling his little brother.
On the evening of the 28th of November, 2009, 17-year-old Andrew Conley was home in Rising Sun, Indiana, babysitting his 10-year-old brother Connor while their parents worked the overnight shift. Andrew had wanted to go out that evening and tried to drop Connor off with their grandmother and then with an uncle, but neither was available to watch him. So the two ended up back home together, and things seemed normal at first. At some point that evening, they started wrestling in the living room, something they had done before. But this time, Andrew got Connor into a chokehold, and he did not let go. According to Andrew's own detailed confession, Connor fought back hard. The little boy struggled and pleaded with his older brother to stop, but Andrew kept squeezing until Connor passed out. He then dragged the boy into the kitchen, pulled on a pair of gloves, and continued strangling him for another 20 minutes. After that, he wrapped 2 plastic bags around Connor's head and secured them with black electrical tape. A coroner later testified that Connor may have still been alive for minutes or even hours after the bags were placed on his head. Andrew then dragged his brother outside by his feet and struck the boy's head against the ground multiple times, just to make absolutely certain he was dead. He loaded Connor's body into the trunk of his car and drove to his girlfriend's house. He spent about 2 hours there, gave her a promise ring, and acted completely normal. His 10-year-old brother's body was in the trunk the entire time. After leaving his girlfriend's house, Andrew drove to a wooded area near a city park and dumped Connor's body under some brush and leaves. He went home before his parents returned, washed the blood off the kitchen floor, and hid his bloody clothes in the closet. The next morning, when his parents came home from their overnight shift, he joked around with his mother and watched football on television like nothing had happened. Nobody at home had any idea what was in the park down the road, but he couldn't keep it to himself. Andrew admitted what he had done to 2 friends the next day, then drove himself to the Rising Sun Police Department and told officers he had accidentally killed his brother during a wrestling match. During the investigation, his statements grew increasingly disturbing. He told police he had fantasized about killing people since he was in 8th grade. He said he identified with the fictional television serial killer Dexter from the Showtime series and had made those comparisons to friends just weeks before the murder. He described his urge to kill as being like a starving person craving a hamburger, something he simply could not resist. He also admitted that on the morning after the murder, he had stood over his sleeping father with a knife and considered killing him too, though he couldn't explain why. Multiple experts examined Andrew, with 3 concluding he was severely mentally ill and a 4th believing he showed signs of psychopathy. Andrew pleaded guilty on the first day of his trial in September 2010. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He appealed multiple times over the following decade, but in June 2022, the Indiana Supreme Court unanimously upheld the life sentence in a final ruling. Cody Metzker-Madsen.
Iowa teen who admitted to killing his 5-year-old foster brother will have another evaluation to see where he'll be treated.
Today's drama in the courtroom, a teenager accused of murdering a little boy takes the stand.
I have listened carefully to all of the testimony and looked at all of the evidence presented in this case.
Cody Metzker-Madsen had been cycling through the foster care system since he was 6 years old. He had bounced between foster homes, treatment centers, and different school districts across Iowa for over a decade. Caseworkers who testified at his trial described how the constant relocations had damaged his self-esteem and reinforced a feeling that nobody wanted him. One caseworker testified that each time a child is placed in foster care and then asked to leave, it does real damage to how that child sees themselves and the world. Another caseworker noted that Cody had difficulty forming lasting connections and that his elaborate fantasy worlds seemed to serve as a way of processing a reality he found overwhelming. By the time he was 17, he had been living with the Kuhlman family in rural Harrison County, Iowa, for about 3 years, one of the longest and most stable placements he had ever had. The Kuhlmans, Julie and Don, were experienced foster parents who also had twin 12-year-old daughters of their own. About 3 weeks before the 31st of August 2013, a new foster child joined the household. His name was Dominic Elkins, and he was 5 years old. Despite the large age gap, Cody and Dominic played together regularly. Cody had a habit of creating elaborate fantasy games based on mythology, science fiction stories, television shows, and video games. He built entire worlds in his head and acted them out, sometimes for hours at a time. On that Saturday afternoon, the two boys were playing outside near the timber and ravine at the edge of the Kuhlman property. Dominic's body was found at the bottom of that ravine later that day. An autopsy determined the 5-year-old had died from a combination of blunt force head injuries and drowning. He had been struck in the head repeatedly with a brick, hard enough that the skull was visible, and then his head had been pushed into the water at the bottom of the ravine. Cody was charged with first-degree murder. At trial, which he chose to have before a judge rather than a jury, Cody testified about what he experienced that day. He said he had entered a fantasy world where the colors and smells around him were slightly different from reality. He described seeing an army of green, ugly little creatures, goblins, that were attacking people he knew. He said he believed he was fighting a goblin commander and did not realize until it was over that the creature he had been striking and pushing into the water was Dominic. The court heard from psychiatrists and behavioral experts who detailed Cody's lifelong history of staring episodes, epilepsy, compulsive behavior, elaborate fantasy characters, and possible hallucinations. One expert described him as someone who frequently could not distinguish between his fantasy world and reality, and noted that his mother had used methamphetamine during her pregnancy with him. Judge Kathleen Kilnosky reviewed all of the evidence and found Cody not guilty by reason of insanity, concluding he had never been mentally normal at any point in his life. The verdict was shocking to many in the community who felt the outcome seemed to leave justice unaddressed. But the judge's reasoning centered on a fundamental question: did Cody understand what he was doing at the moment it happened? Based on the evidence, she concluded he did not. Instead of prison, he was committed indefinitely to a state medical facility for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. He will remain in state custody until officials determine he is no longer a danger to himself or others. Nehemiah Griego.
This afternoon, an Albuquerque judge released her decision. Nehemiah Griego will get life for murdering his parents and 3 younger siblings when he was just 15 years old.
We heard the jail calls and the police interviews, but tonight we hear Nehemiah Griego in court for the first time.
Action 7 News reporter Justin Matthews was inside the courtroom. He joins us live to show us how Griego addressed his family.
In January 2013, 15-year-old Nehemiah Griego was living with his parents and 4 siblings in a home in the South Valley area south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. His father, Greg Griego, was 51 years old, a former pastor at Calvary Chapel, one of Albuquerque's largest churches, and a volunteer chaplain with the city's fire department. He was well known throughout the community for his ministry work with jail inmates and the homeless, and was considered a pillar of the congregation. His mother, Sarah, was 40 years old. Nehemiah had told investigators he was frustrated with his mother, though he never fully explained what had built up the anger to that level. On the night of January 19, Nehemiah waited until his mother fell asleep. Then, he pulled a .22 caliber rifle out of the bedroom closet and shot her twice in the face as she lay in bed. The gunshot woke his 9-year-old brother Zephaniah, who had been sleeping next to their mother, When Nehemiah told his brother that their mother was dead, Zephaniah didn't believe him, so Nehemiah picked up his mother's head and showed his younger brother her bloody face. When Zephaniah became upset, Nehemiah shot him in the head with the same rifle. Nehemiah later told investigators that after those 2 shootings, he chose to turn off his conscience. He walked into the bedroom where his 5-year-old sister Jael and his 2-year-old sister Angelina were crying and shot both of them. 4 members of his family were now dead, but Nehemiah was not finished. His father was still alive, working a volunteer graveyard shift at a homeless shelter. Nehemiah armed himself with the family's AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and waited. When Greg Griego returned home around 5 a.m., Nehemiah ambushed him and shot him multiple times. After the killings, Nehemiah loaded weapons into the family van and told investigators he had considered driving to a nearby Walmart to carry out a mass shooting. He never followed through on it. Instead, he spent the rest of the day at Calvary Chapel, wandering the campus while dozens of Sunday school teachers were being trained on how to respond to an active shooter, completely unaware that the pastor's own son had just killed 5 people a few miles away. The training had been scheduled before any of this happened, which made the whole thing almost impossible to process. He later texted a photo of his mother's body to his girlfriend. Eventually, a church security guard grew concerned, drove Nehemiah home, saw the crime scene, and called police. The case wound through the courts for over 6 years, becoming one of the most complex juvenile sentencing cases in New Mexico history. He initially pleaded guilty in October 2015 to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of child abuse, resulting in death, and was sentenced as a juvenile, meaning he would be released on his 21st birthday. But just 11 days before his scheduled release, the state's Court of Appeals ordered a new hearing. A new judge, Elisa Hart, determined that Nehemiah was not amenable to treatment as a juvenile and should be sentenced as an adult. In November 2019, at age 22, Griego was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences for the murders of his 3 siblings, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, plus 2 concurrent 7-year sentences for the murders of his parents. He will be eligible for parole when he is 52 years old. Tyler Hadley.
Well, this afternoon marks the next chapter in the case against a Port St. Lucie teenager accused of killing his parents and throwing a party with their bodies still inside the home.
A few weeks before the 16th of July 2011, 17-year-old Tyler Hadley told a friend in Port St. Lucie, Florida, that he was thinking about killing his parents and throwing a party in the house afterward. He said it had never been done before. His friend didn't take him seriously because Tyler had said things like that before. Tyler had a long history of problems, including arson, vandalism, thefts, and aggravated battery. There was also a civil suit pending after he hit and injured a child while driving his father's car in 2010. His parents, Blake and Mary Jo, had enrolled him in an outpatient drug treatment program, which hadn't worked because he kept using anyway. He had already been caught with marijuana and had a history of sneaking out and staying out past curfew. Knowing he was about to turn 18, they had recently found an inpatient treatment program for him. Tyler didn't want to go, and according to prosecutors, that was one of the things that pushed him over the edge. On the morning of July 16, he posted a Facebook invite, letting people know there would be a party at his house that night. Later that afternoon, he took 3 pills of ecstasy. He hid his parents' cell phones so they couldn't call for help. He locked the family's black Labrador in a closet, suspecting the dog might try to protect them. Tyler stood behind his mother, Mary Jo, who was 47, as she sat at her computer in the family room. He stood there for about 5 minutes, working up the nerve. Then he struck her in the back of the head with a claw hammer. His father, Blake, who was 54, heard the screams and rushed out of the bedroom. When Blake saw what was happening and looked at his son, Tyler struck him with the hammer too. Both parents were killed. Tyler then spent 3 hours cleaning up the blood. He covered the bodies with books, towels, and files and locked the bedroom door. That evening, roughly 60 people showed up to the party at the Hadley home. People were inside the house eating, drinking, and socializing, just feet away from a locked bedroom where both of Tyler's parents lay dead beneath piles of books and household items. Tyler mingled with guests, drank, and acted like nothing was wrong. At one point during the night, he pulled a close friend aside and confessed what he had done. The friend didn't believe him at first, so Tyler showed him a bloody footprint in the garage and then walked him to the locked bedroom. The friend reported it to police the next day. Tyler was arrested and initially pleaded not guilty, but changed his plea to no contest in February 2014. Judge Robert Makehamson sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, calling the crime brutal, heinous, and premeditated. The judge also accused Tyler of manipulating mental health experts and lying about hearing voices during evaluations. A fellow inmate later told police that Tyler had been signing autographs in jail and referring to himself as Hammerboy. In 2016, an appeals court ordered a resentencing because Florida law had changed to prohibit mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles. In December 2018, Judge Gary Sweet upheld the 2 life sentences, saying if Tyler Hadley didn't deserve life, nobody did. The sentence now includes a mandatory review after 25 years from his original arrest in 2011. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale.
That the defendant, Willard Noble Chayton Miller, should be sentenced to life.
Nehemiah Griego was 66 years old and had been teaching Spanish at Fairfield High School in Iowa for 9 years. Her students and colleagues described her as a warm, dedicated teacher whose joy was contagious. Former students said she had a way of making the classroom feel welcoming even for kids who struggled with the language. She was originally from Mexico and had become a beloved figure in Fairfield, a small city of about 9,400 people, roughly 100 miles southeast of Des Moines. Every day after school, Griego would drive to Chautauqua Park and take a walk. It was her routine, and everyone who knew her knew about it, including 2 of her students. On the 2nd of November 2021, 16-year-old Willard Miller and 16-year-old Jeremy Goodale followed Griego to the park. They had been planning this for about 2 weeks, according to testimony Goodale later provided. The motive, according to prosecutors, started with a bad grade. Miller was failing Griego's Spanish class and was worried the grade would prevent him from going on an overseas study trip. So instead of speaking with a counselor or talking to his parents, he and Goodale decided to kill her. Earlier that afternoon, Miller had actually met with Griego at school to discuss his failing grade. After that meeting, Griego drove her van to the park for her daily walk as usual. Miller and Goodale were already there, waiting. They ambushed her on the path and beat her with a baseball bat that Miller had provided. Both teens later gave conflicting accounts of who actually swung the bat. Miller maintained he only served as a lookout and that Goodale did the physical beating. Goodale testified that Miller initiated the plan and that both of them struck Griego. Investigators noted there was blood found on Goodale's clothing, but none on Miller's. After the attack, the 2 dragged Griego's body off the path and concealed it under a tarp, a wheelbarrow, and railroad ties. They left the park and went about their evening like nothing had happened. The next morning, Griego's husband and colleagues at the school reported her missing when she didn't show up for work and wasn't answering her phone. Her body was discovered in the park later that day, still concealed beneath the tarp, wheelbarrow, and railroad ties exactly where Miller and Goodale had left her. The small town of Fairfield was shaken, and police moved fast. Classmates of Miller and Goodale provided evidence pointing in their direction, including social media messages, and both teens were arrested within hours. Both were charged as adults with first-degree murder. Because they were 16 at the time, they were not subject to mandatory life without parole under Iowa law. Both eventually pleaded guilty in April 2023. At Miller's sentencing in July 2023, Judge Sean Showers handed him life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. 5 years more than what prosecutors had even recommended. The judge described Miller as sinister and evil. Goodale was sentenced in November 2023 and received life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The judge said Goodale was a better candidate for rehabilitation than Miller, but was not comfortable leaving the minimum sentence open-ended. Both were also ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution to Griego's family. At his sentencing, Goodale addressed the court and said he was truly sorry, that what he had taken could never be replaced, and that every day he wished he could go back and stop himself. Whether that remorse was genuine or not is something the Griego family has had to sit with ever since. Jesse Osborne.
Sentence is going to be life in prison for murders. It's going to be 30 years on the attempted murders. We have 10 days to repeat.
On the 28th of September 2016, 14-year-old Jesse Osborne sat behind his father, 47-year-old Jeffrey Osborne, in their home in Townville, South Carolina. Jeffrey was sitting in a chair, reading, facing away from his son. Jesse picked up a .40 caliber handgun and shot his father 3 times in the back of the head. Before leaving the house, Jesse put on a vest he wore when playing with airsoft guns. He kissed his pet rabbit, Floppy, and hugged his 3 dogs. Then, he called his grandmother, crying and mumbling incoherently, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. Jesse climbed into his father's pickup truck and drove 3 miles to Townville Elementary School, the school he had attended years earlier before being expelled from his next school, West Oak Middle, for bringing a machete and a knife in his backpack. He had been attending virtual school at the time of the shooting. The weapons incident at West Oak had happened because another boy was bullying both Jesse and an autistic girl he considered a friend. After the expulsion, Jesse became increasingly isolated and withdrawn, spending more time online researching violence. At approximately 1:44 p.m., Jesse drove the pickup truck through the fence surrounding the school's playground. He jumped out of the vehicle and began firing at students who were outside for recess, shouting as he went. Children scattered and ran toward the building. He shot a teacher named Megan Hollingsworth and 2 students. One of those students was 6-year-old Jacob Hall, a first grader, who was hit in a major artery in his thigh. A volunteer firefighter named Jamie Brock tackled and restrained Jesse before he could continue. His gun had jammed, which likely prevented far more casualties. Jacob Hall was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The blood loss had been massive, and his body had gone into cardiopulmonary arrest. 3 days later, on October 1, he was taken off life support. His family held a superhero-themed funeral for him, and a portion of a road in Townville was later named in his honor. The scope of what Jesse had actually planned went far beyond what he carried out that day. Investigators recovered text messages and found a secret Instagram group that prosecutors described as a sleeper cell of would-be school shooters. Jesse had spent weeks researching mass shootings, with a particular fixation on the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary massacre, and had studied that killer's background in detail. Text messages indicated he had intended to kill between 50 and 60 students at Townville Elementary. During his sentencing hearing in November 2019, Jesse's family painted a picture of a troubled household. His uncle, Tommy Osborne, testified that Jeffrey would start drinking in the mornings after tending to the animals on their chicken farm and would become mean and violent when intoxicated. Jesse's defense attorney argued that the boy had been abused at home by his father and bullied at school, with no safe place to go. Jesse had pleaded guilty in December 2018 to 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. At his sentencing, he told the judge he wished it had never happened and that he didn't know exactly why he did it. He asked for hope and for help. Judge Lawton McIntosh sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 2 murders, plus an additional 30 years for the attempted murders. In September 2023, the court administratively changed his sentence from 2 life terms to 75 years for each count of murder. The change was not a reduction at all. It was a procedural adjustment designed to allow Jesse to participate in programs within the South Carolina Department of Corrections that required a numerical sentence rather than a life designation.